Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. In today's episode, we engage with the existentialism of Benjamin Fondane, an existentialist philosopher who is not widely celebrated in the English-speaking world, but whose name enjoys renown among Francophones. Fondane was both a poet and philosopher, and he was comrades with notable writers of his era. He also died tragically in a Nazi death camp at the end of World War II. Today we are looking at his essay, Existential Monday, and the Sunday of History, an essay which seeks to define the role of the existential philosopher against those philosophies which he claims erase or obscure the existent. With us today we have Adam, Will, and Taylor. The conversation is already in progress, so let's hop in.
I got to read the essay twice, and I read the translator's biographical introduction, which I found fascinating. This is the first time I've read Fondane or even heard of him.
Same.
Sadly. So, I give props to translators that seek out those minor voices. As you guys know, that's kind of my little fetish. And so this is good. And I also, for this, because of the, in that middle part of the essay, he talks about, anxiety before logic, etc. I went back and read it's really only two paragraphs. They're long paragraphs, but it's in the psychical and collective part of Simondon's Ilthy, and he's got a section on anxiety that I thought resonated. I know I didn't want to give you guys extra homework, so I'll just mention there's some cool stuff going on there.
Well, like maybe before we hop in, if Adam can sort of give us a little bit of a philosophical / biographical introduction about Fondane, because what's interesting is a lot of, at least in the United States, when we're initially exposed to literature that would be called existential, right? It's often contextualized within the Second World War, particularly Camus, Beauvoir, and Sartre. And Fondane's relationship to the Second World War is the most intimate that it can be. So if Adam could just give us a little bit of a head start on who this author is, and maybe talk about why we haven't heard of Fondane among, the post-Heideggerian, Husserlian, existential writers.
I mean, he was quite well connected in terms of Emile Cioran, but that's how you pronounce it. But it doesn't seem like it seemed that he got kind of lost. Also, in the sense that a lot of people, when he died, didn't know he was dead.
So he was killed at Birkenau in 1944, right at the end.
Yeah, it said October, right?
Yeah, so that's right towards the end of the
occupation, yeah.
The occupation and sort of the mass liquidation. He's writing with a remarkable contemporary eye. I mean, he's responding to Camus, newer readings of Kierkegaard, even Sartre, whose existential landmark text, Being and Nothingness, would have just started to have been circulated. I think here is where the concept of intersectionality becomes really important, right? So Fondane is responding to, at least in the first third to the first half of the essay, Søren Kierkegaard, probably one of the most influential proto-existentialists ever. But also, he's taking to task sort of a very interesting relationship that's sometimes overlooked between Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And I sometimes struggle to see the direct linkage between Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. I'm aware of the critique that's present in texts like Zarathustra, right? Kierkegaard is a man who wants to prepare you for a good night's sleep. But here it seems to be more philosophically dense in a way that I'm usually not prepared to address. Sort of the idea of sort of Nietzsche, the Nietzschean self. So maybe where we start is we start with Fondane's reading of Kierkegaard, because as a Jewish man in the 1940s, it must have been interesting to navigate those texts.
Well, I think one of the interesting starting points for this essay, not to say that we can't get started using Kierkegaard, but how he comes into the essay with the mention of the young Hegel versus the old Hegel, but using that to contextualize an understanding of law as self-legislating and autonomous. And it seems he wants to draw in that critique to set up his own critique of philosophy and universal reason as something that rises above the existent or the human being.
Which is interesting as well, because it seems also anti-Judaic, I guess.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a very like typical Christian critique of Judaism, which is quite interesting. But I don't know how much we want to go on to that stuff again. It's very...
I just think it's interesting nonetheless, because he's making some similar moves that, Deleuze will make later down the line in his work on Kant and Deleuze's work on the law, in the sense that, like for Plato, for example, law appears to us as a second best to the good. And then further down the line in the history of Western philosophy, we have with Kant now the self-legislation and the autonomization of the law. So law is just escalating up degree by degree into the sort of transcendent firmament that now looks down over us and does not allow us to escape and subsumes the existent within it. And it seems this is what Fondane is railing against, also because the very material conditions within which he's living mirror the philosophies that he's critiquing.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting too is that his critique that I guess you can sort of tangentially tie to Kant is comparable to the one present in Nietzsche too. But one thing that I'm confused about, because I've not read young Hegel. I know that the Life of Jesus, that text that Hegel sort of threw together with a very particular kind of flair. It's one that Hegel had like a weird relationship with as he grew older. And maybe someone can help me understand why this sort of early, blatantly Kantian Hegel is important to understand the way in which Fondane bifurcates the nature of the existent and existence proper.
I'm not familiar with the essay, the Life of Jesus, but I do know some stuff about his other early theological writings, the ones usually clicked together, which is the positivity of the Christian religion and the spirit of Christianity and its fate. And I think the latter one is probably the most formative one in the young Hegelian time, because that's when he originally rejects Kant and talks about sort of Christian love as sort of something that is imminently sort of transcendence. So that transcends transcendence and unifies things throughout contradiction. It's the love is kind of the basis of the concept as it develops in the late young, like sort of the later period of the young Hegel and his turn towards Christianity. And sort of Fondane is responding to a very conservative Hegelianism. I don't know if did Kierkegaard do his shitty fucking lectures at this point?
Yeah, that was more in like the 20s and 30s, but yeah.
That's the damage already been done. Yeah. So the lectures.
I still remember coming to the chat one afternoon, and I was like, Adam, I'm sorry, I'm reading Kojève.
Well, it's great to read. It's just I don't know what it has to do with Hegel.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, so, okay, the damage had been done, I guess, by Kojève, and I think he's responding to this idea that, he says, in the early Hegel, he affirms the idea that, the Christian idea that man is made, the law is made for man, not the man made for the law. In contrast, later Hegel, especially in sort of the introduction, there's just introductory lectures to the philosophy of history. He meant, it's more of a case of man is made for history, man is man is born and dies upon the slaughter bench of history, as Hegel puts it, and we're just sort of caught up in this rush of necessity, and there's spirit is already sort of moving through us and moving beyond us before we can have anything to do with it. The logic has already sort of predetermined our course in advance, as Hegel has done it, as he's retroactively looked throughout history and come to his conclusions. And I think Fondane's sort of reacting in the sense of which we're caught in logic. We're caught in the logic of these abstractions of history. And this is something that's already been concluded and delimited in advance by what he calls the privileged position of speculative philosophy, Hegel's speculative philosophy, which is the position of the after, sort of seeing, after all's been and done, what's fixed, what's immutable, what intelligence, what mind is, what we can possibly know. And to be limited by this knowledge is something that he wants to struggle against, because he says, logic may be unshakable, but it cannot really resist a man who wants to live.
So we're kind of gathering up the strands here in the essay. I'm curious what Taylor thinks about Fondane's take on non-knowledge, especially given Taylor's work on Laruelle, and then maybe we can even bring Adam in again too, talking about Bataille and non-knowledge, because recently I put that tweet, that little clip from Inner Experience, and I think it was like the number 2 tweet of all time for Acid Horizon, which is really weird. But I think there's something that needs to be said about the non-philosophical in relation to universal reason and logic. I'm curious if you made any connections, Taylor.
There's this, starting off with that quote, right? The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And of course, as Fondane elaborates, right, this in the very first paragraph, law was made for man, not man for the law. Laruelle too, because he's, he's not very, at least after his first several books in the 70s, he basically just stops making citations and really just relies on allusions, or maybe he'll name drop every now and then, right? He does more or less take up that notion. I believe he even reprises this turn of phrase in his essay on generalized analysis, on non-analysis, where he's going to talk about in the 20th century, the Judaic turn, which, its two sides is, obviously the linguistic turn with Saussure, but also, this turn of psychoanalysis being more and more deeply intertwined with philosophy's goals. And I'll just say quickly about the non-philosophy stuff, in a certain sense, you could say that Laruelle's idea behind a science of philosophy, a generic science that would be able to take philosophy and take it no longer as fact, but as datum, and to and that being sort of a basis of inspiration for non-philosophy proper, is this notion that philosophy is made for man, not man for philosophy. And so, and this is why he'll say at the end of Philosophy and Non-Philosophy that the Marxian notion of an Ausgang, of an outgoing or an exit from philosophy, is a false problem, right? That it's only a type of bewitchment, a type of ensorcelment that makes us believe as humans that we are always already in philosophy, right? But with his notion of radical immanence and the one and all of these things, that's a kind of transcendental illusion, and it's that type of illusion that gives philosophy its power of exploitation, of thought, of man, etc. And I see Fondane doing something similar here, especially as we get towards the end of the essay, with this notion of a kind of this kind of, whether he as his name's Bruce, right? The
Bruce
translator,
Baugh,
as he points out in the biographical note, but as Fondane says himself too at the end, this notion of sort of philosophy providing appeasement, whether it be appeasing our mental faculties or providing this type of calm. And he's wanting to call that into question, right? And wanting to He's wanting to put pressure on that sort of foregone conclusion, right? That we're sort of left with this notion of a being in the role of imagining Sisyphus happy, or imagining Sisyphus imagining himself happy, right? So I kind of see something there too with Laruelle is sort of putting turning the tables, if you will, right, on philosophy and its claims.
Adam, I'm curious, because clearly this is a critique of Hegel. What is our path to redemption for Hegel in view of this essay?
I mean, this is. I mean, if you go to the lectures on history, I mean, this is the sort of reaction that it deserved for something that's incredibly. That's just the utter seriousness of Hegel, but the force of talking about history in such authoritative terms in ways that I think Hegel's later conservatism definitely shines through. And it talks about the appeasement of when the hussars arrive, when the real force of the negative comes upon you, you have to really admit that the finite is nothing before it. And he says, chatter falls silent in the face of the seriousness of history. And it's this kind of seriousness that kind of was an element of sacrifice to this kind of seriousness, I guess. But the thing is, with universal seriousness as someone like Hegel's, you don't necessarily get to choose or not of you being sacrificed or not. Yeah, I mean, I do think this hits on a really big problem in Hegel, especially when it comes to the rejection of philosophy as a totalizing system of abstraction and of knowledge, because something that also comes up in the work of people like Bataille as well, who I'm not too sure if Fondane might have been around the circles of, but Bataille and Fondane were both coming out of a very sort of strong revulsion against the surrealists, and particularly their fealty to orthodox forms of Marxism and communism. Generally, it's the idea that the problem of adapting yourself to uncertainty and unknowledge. Unknowledge is something that's very hard to think about in Hegelian terms, because we have this notion of the system, the grand system of German idealism that will swallow and explain everything and regurgitate it back out in a form that its contradictions have been made malleable and taken into these forms of, Hegelian freedom, Hegelian state, Hegelian self-consciousness, the forms of consciousness that have been listed so far. And there's a big strain in post-Hegelian thinking of is there any room for unknowledge? Is there any room for anything to be different, or to is there any room for difference as such, as people like Deleuze would say? Yeah, to go back to Bataille, I mean, this is also brought up in Derrida's essay on Bataille and Hegel from Writing a Difference, but there's a problem of where is the meaninglessness? Is there anything that's allowed to just be non-meaningful? Is there anything that's allowed to struggle against the system, to resist knowledge, even, not appease knowledge, as Fondane says, and obviously there's a strong notice of appeasement and collaboration here, given this being written during the occupation. And I guess the general sense of Bataille, Hegel, is there room for unknowledge in Hegel? I think there is, because I think Hegel's system is ultimately very sort of self-sacrificing in terms of its end result. So the phenomenology of spirit ends with the sacrifice of consciousness itself in the figure of Christ, actually, which is actually, I think, quite a return to the young Hegel. The end of the logic ends with the free discharge of all its energies and leaving the world barren of subjectivity after it. And the incredibly reactionary philosophy of mind at least ends on the positive note that it becomes absolute mind, the self-understanding, it becomes free to expose itself to all kinds of new forms of self-enjoyment. So I think there is room for a post-knowledge, or a knowledge beyond, or sort of an unknowledge there. I just think, especially given the conservative Hegel we're getting at this point in time, maybe as well with Kierkegaard and his bollocks of making a master-slave everything, and that's why Napoleon, if you read it properly, Stalin is like, the agent of history and the new Christ or some bollocks like that. But yeah, this is definitely a philosophy of struggle, of resistance to knowledge, and finding the space for unknowledge as it relates to sort of the reality of life.
So do you think your interpretation of Hegel in this instance runs counter to what Bataille says about supplication and satisfaction, that self-sacrifice somehow takes the place of, or is the same thing as, a kind of supplication that could occur within the system?
Yeah, he says Hegel annuls supplication, because he supplication as a form of, supplication just means a kind of begging,
right?
Because he feels satisfied with the system, and I think Fondane doesn't want satisfaction. I was talking before the we were recording about the Henry Rollins bit, and he talks about rewriting the Rolling Stones song. I don't want no satisfaction, because he doesn't want the struggle to end. And I guess that's where the Hegelianism kind of stops in any sort of linkage to Fondane, because it's a spurious infinity of always trying to struggle. But even though he doesn't want the satisfaction of finally winning the struggle, because he can't, because it's dependent on struggling, he thinks that's worth it in itself. He doesn't even want the comforts of something like what's being offered by Albert Camus, who's actually at this conference and was probably, I don't know why he published Sisyphus after reading this, because what was the point? Because, as Fondane says, yes, the only reason to imagine Sisyphus happy is actually to have the satisfaction of sort of your own heroic view of oneself, and the satisfaction of having the intellectual honesty to not do what, the philosophical suicide of Kierkegaard and become a Christian. So he says, as long as there's intellectual honesty, you're still more or less caught in it. Knowledge is fine of this, because at least you're intellectually honest. Whereas this constant struggle, even logically speaking, even though it can't be resisted, it can never end. It cannot hold you back.
Well, with that said, I don't want to skip Will's Kierkegaard comment. Will, did you want to elaborate on the connections you made?
With Kierkegaard, it's more fascinating to me because, obviously that's where my Hegel gets smuggled in. So I know Adam, will be frustrated by that. But that's just simply how it is. I do wonder about the tension present in Kierkegaard, particularly in the way that he addresses anxiety. I want to start to maybe provide a bit of a contrast between a sort of very specific reading of the concept of anxiety with maybe something Taylor said earlier about a couple pages from Simondon on anxiety. And maybe that's where we can start to sort of bridge all of these very disparate readings.
Did you want to elaborate more on the Simondon stuff?
Yeah, I mean, just really quickly, the thing about the reason why I was thinking about Simondon and what's so interesting about this little section, because this occurs, this occurs after he's laid out not just his idea of we have to start with individuation, we have to start with understanding what ontogenesis properly is, and then he will kind of take us through the technical example of the of making the brick and all that preparation, and then he'll start with physical individuation with the crystal, which is kind of the first concrete, energetic example, if you will, in nature, and then he'll work through the biological, and by this point he has now moved on to psychical individuation, which he's already told us implies a trans-individual individuation that isn't merely a kind of person-to-person inter-individual relation, but is actually this dynamic constitution of the collective. And so his point about anxiety, what I find so interesting about it is, without relying upon, even if it's obviously evoking for the reader, who at the time especially would have, whether it be Kierkegaard or Heidegger or even a Freudian lens, right? He kind of eschews all those different discourses and puts it in terms of his ideas of individuation. And so for him, the main thing that I find interesting about this theory of anxiety, to just keep it simple and not go through the two paragraphs here, is basically that with anxiety, there is the subject feels like it's posing this problem to itself, but it can't resolve this problem. And the problem really is about the division of the individuated being here and now and the pre-individual nature, from which more charges of being and becoming are always sort of being tapped into. And the reason why the individual or the individuated being, as he says, it calls itself into question through anxiety, and it poses these problems, and it tries to be it wants to be like an infinity of other heres and nows, but is constrained by this one here and now. And it can't solve this problem by itself, precisely because it forgoes the trans-individual relation or the collective individuation that would allow it to go beyond itself. And so I think that's what I find really interesting here, that resonates with what Fondane's talking about with Kierkegaard and with sort of beginning with anxiety rather than with being or logic, that it's precisely this calling into question of oneself by oneself, and the lack of the means to resolve that problem in a way that would allow for a new individuation, would allow for a trans individual relation with which the individual being would be in resonance with. And so I think that that's why Simondon's discussion of anxiety is probably like my favorite little section in the whole book, both volumes. It's some of the most beautiful prose, and I think it really resonates here. Even though there's more going on in that section, I think that's like the meat of it that really vibes with what we read today.
Yeah, I found it really interesting that Fondane's reading of anxiety through Hegel, Kierkegaard, it's really, really, really similar to Kierkegaard's reading of sin. And maybe, a Kierkegaard scholar will like bash me, hop into my DMs, ask me where I go to school, and have my card revoked. But there's this idea here that sin, at least in the concept of anxiety, the original sin sort of signifies something other than sin itself, or the way that we understand sin. I think the way Kierkegaard puts it is sin like any other. But all sin subsequent of the original sin, right, is referent back to it. So in a certain sense, anxiety, at least as Fondane, and I think correctly, attests that like anxiety exists throughout these texts in a sense that it always refers back to a broader, ingraspable disposition that we have with either like nothingness or universality. So in a certain sense, what you can get with Fondane is actually, and this is going to be like so heretical, but what you can kind of get with Fondane through his kind of passing critique of Kierkegaard is this possibility of an actual reading of Hegel that doesn't necessarily find itself in contradiction with Kierkegaard, right? Because despair is this inability to bridge the finite with the infinite. And if you have the reading of Hegel that Fondane does, or at least that like Adam has taken a little bit of an issue with, you sort of get this same sort of instability at the level of the subject. And that's why particularly I think what Taylor had to say about what is it? Trans-individualizing?
Or you could call it trans-individuation or the trans-individual. He calls it a number of those things.
And that's why I was particularly interested in that, because I think that part of what he's doing, though he'll still take issue with, in the same way that Camus does, the sort of philosophical suicide of that whole thing. What he's sort of trying to do is the broadest synthesis paper I've ever seen in my life. In undergrad, you hear from professors, you have these grandiose ideas, and they think, why don't you adjust your iron sights a bit and shoot for a target that's a little bit tighter than that. But yeah, I just think that it's interesting to me in the way that Fondane says like spirit is power only when it looks like the negative in the eye or something, or in the face. That's not necessarily something that's directly incompatible with the Kierkegaardian notion of the self and spirit in Sickness Unto Death.
Fondane has a whole bunch of targets here. Clearly, there's Hegel, there's Kierkegaard. But interestingly, I think in the summation of his existential philosophy, he chooses Leibniz's monad as the target par excellence, at least in terms of the kind of philosophical concept that resists the embodiment of the existent that he's agitating for. And the idea that the concept could be like this little submarine with no doors or windows, right? That's hermetically sealed from the existent, nonetheless internalizes the creativity, and the will is actually the word that he uses. The will to be philosophical, the will to create or construct a system gets internalized within the system in a way that either preempts the existent or cuts it off from it. And while inside this enclosure, it's kind of gnawing and burrowing. It wants out. It wants to achieve that limit. And I connect it to Nietzsche too, because what gets echoed in Fondane's critique of Leibniz's monad is the kind of impotence of the existent that you see in Nietzsche's critique of Socrates, for example. Just off the heels of reading The Vicious Circle, I'm thinking about the way that Klosowski highlights Nietzsche's own worry about thought as any kind of philosophical thought being an expression of this impotence of the will. And it seems that Fondane, he's kind of going to a similar place, but he seems a little bit more confident or a little bit more hopeful about the way that thought can approach this limit and face the vastness or the abyss of unknowledge and exist in this liminal space between knowledge and unknowledge in a way that validates the project of philosophy, but not one which attempts to construct an insular form of reason.
I mean, it's a tall order, right?
Yeah. Is it though? Yeah, maybe it is. I think there's just a risk anytime that we attempt to construct a system of thought.
Yeah, it's just like whenever that's the case, right? The first thing I think of is unreason, right? Unreason in the sense that the second that we construct sort of a universal rationality, there has to immediately be something outside the bounds, right? A good Marxist professor will say that something begets its own negation, right? In a sense that the construction of rationality must always create the unrational or the irrational. That I for that reason, I do think it's a tall order. But if you can explain to me how someone can walk that tightrope in the way that, Kierkegaard walks a tightrope his entire career with Hegel.
I think the key for Fondane, and if, by the way, you want to look at this essay and you don't want to read the whole thing and maybe just sort of extract from it its most important kernel, he really begins to summarize his argument towards the very end of the essay, where he starts talking about, he says, it's on page 28 of the paperback edition. He says, the task I have set myself here is to distinguish between what is and what is not existential philosophy. And from there, he sort of recounts everything that he's kind of bumped into in his critique of Hegel and Kierkegaard previously in the essay, but now centering the crosshairs on Leibniz. And what he lands upon is the notion that the limit of any system of philosophy for an existential philosopher should be an embodiment or an approach to the space within its inability to think, which instigates a kind of torture, or he uses the word a spur for the philosopher.
Yeah.
And so insofar as the philosopher is in touch with those tensions, then they are doing existential philosophy. The other thing that he mentions too, and I want to get the quote right here. It regards refusal, and it's interesting.
I've got the quote.
Oh, you probably took that one down too. And it's interesting, after doing the recent episode on difference and repetition and the notion of philosophy as a refusal in Deleuze, this really echoes that sentiment quite nicely. The refusal to be enclosed within a system, the refusal to accept any presupposition or limit, and which is also, I think, in part, a refusal to accept our unwillingness to be in the space of the unintelligible, to stare into the abyss, as it were, or to be in a space at which thought is threatened somehow, or just for the philosopher themselves, to be in a space of non-thinking, to be in a space of silence. There are many ways that I think that refusal can be enacted.
Yeah, I mean, I'll read out the quote. It's just a brilliant bit of writing. So, it is then that the existent... No, so just actually, before we go into this, I guess it's pretty good to clarify on the existence. So the existent, or depending on what to pronounce it, is sort of Fondane's term for the subject of existentialism, the existential thinker. Because whereas philosophy, especially Hegelian philosophy, speculative philosophy, takes as its realm sort of the retrospective act of looking back at things after they have occurred or after deductions occurred and drawing conclusions from
Yeah, the
kind
owl
of
of
movement.
Minerva.
Yeah, the existent, as is given pretty well in, I guess, the German term Dasein, the their being is always a being that exists, is in the process of existing in duration. And I think moving on with that sort of in the middle, in media res kind of framing of the existent, then I'll just go on to the quote, which is, "It is then that the existent knows that his freedom is refusal, the refusal of everything that tends to enclose him forever in his own immanence, and offers him only false exits, false transcendences, the self over the self, of his knowledge over his existence, of universal reason over his knowledge, of a God parallel to his immanence, who in turn cannot go out of himself, etc." So,
brilliant.
the enclosure of one's own immanence is, I guess, in the most immediate sense, sort of the Hegelian notion of being of the true infinite. So the immanence that becomes self-enclosing and self-limiting. And this is completely incompatible with Fondane's philosophy of refusal, because refusal and to embrace refusal and to embrace the struggle, I guess, is to embrace the spurious infinity as the line that goes onwards and onwards. It doesn't want to be closed off. It thinks that all abstraction is merely a logical ploy to sort of capture the essence of his self. Because the thing about anxiety, I guess, as we've already mentioned, is that for someone like Hegel, someone like Kant, or someone like Kierkegaard, there's sort of a logical dimension. Well, less Kierkegaard really, but there's a logical dimension that provides the unity of the self, the transcendental unity of apperception, of the I that sublates all of its moments in unifying the individual whose I that is. Whereas for Fondane, the fundamental thing that unites us into a coherent identity or coherent self or space of selfhood is the fact that we're anxious about everything all the time on an existential level. Existence is anxiety, and that is a pre-logical disposition built into us that can't be quite spun out in the sort of enclosing ways that Hegel and people like him do.
Looking at this, it raised the question whether the task of philosophy can be manifold in the sense that, I immediately started thinking of the notion of the constellation of philosophy, because there's something that's happening in Fondane's work here that kind of runs counter to that, insofar as philosophy is actually a vehicle to put us further in touch with that which disrupts or prevents us from being consoled. The question is, as a thinker or as a human being, how do we navigate those poles? In terms of somebody like Fondane, living in the world that he lived within, he was confronting, some very real sabers. His death was imminent at the time of writing this, and he was probably thinking to himself, how does one assert one's existence in a way so that we are not dominated. I don't know how else to say it. When you have Nazi trench coats banging on your door, or it comes time for you to march down the hallway to the gas chamber, at what point does philosophy avail us? Is it in providing us with calm, or is it providing us with the ability to absorb the torture, or at least exist in the space of anxiety and agony? And so I think that for me, that's kind of an open question after reading this, just for me, maybe not for Fondane, but it got me thinking in that direction regardless.
I like that he makes it out that if we take him at his word that he's trying, as you pointed out, Craig, and reading at the end of the essay, that he's trying to distinguish what makes a philosophy existential or not, right? And I think that I like, he says a couple pages before that, or maybe it's in the middle of the essay rather, where he's critiquing this notion that philosophy begins in wonder, which is a very classic definition, right? And he's saying that that in fact, what for him grounds, what for him precedes this is this sort of grasping at ways of seeking out or discovering our own impotence, right? And then from there, being able to relate that impotence to something that can then act, whether it be struggle, resistance, whether it be that moment of finding, the monad insufferable, intolerable, all this, right? So it's almost it's a means of it's the presence of the intolerable like surging up within us that precedes wonder. And he makes it out that it's really a privilege of speculative philosophy, this kind of unquestioned privilege that can then seat itself in wonder and sort of take itself as as this irrefutable presence whereby everything else is just chatter, right? So I think it's this intolerability, whether it be the absurd or however you want to describe it, that for Fondane it takes precedence and really is the sort of the engine of that feeling of not wanting to merely resign oneself in the face of the demand, not of sacrifice, right, as he points out with Hegel, but of willing our own sacrifice, right? And it's that unwillingness that is actually primordial, which is why I think this notion of existence as a useless passion for Fondane is called into question and deconstructed. Like, as what do we mean by what do we mean by useless? What do we mean by passion? And how are those primordial rather than something we get at the end of a series of thinking?
I want to push a little bit on his use of the useless passion, because I do think that understanding of useless is essential here for existentialists. It's part of the reason why I think I'm hesitant with Fondane a little bit on those parts of the essay. With useless passion, to me, it just, what is being said there is sort of the standard existence essence positioning, right? That man possesses not, or person possesses not a, predefinite, a primordial use in the way that, say, a knife or whatever does. It's not this sort of emptiness, this sort of vacuous passion. It's that the passion's not sort of predetermined in an axiomatic relationship outside of it. It doesn't have something, it doesn't exist for a purpose. It goes back to this reality that law is made for man, not man made for law, and so on. So I just, with that section, I struggle to see exactly what Fondane means when he tries to critique. I think it's Sartre there.
Yeah, I believe that's where he gets that phrase from, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite useful to focus on maybe the idea of a useless passion as a kind of pure kind of expenditure or loss, because the struggle is something that in rejecting satisfaction really cannot properly be won. But I think this is definitely part of what you're saying, Taylor, on the intolerability of it that calls us to this kind of new forms of philosophy. Because if you look at the beginner's essay, there's a little historical background note, and it says written in February 1944 during the occupation, at a time we had scarcely left his apartment, had no money, and barely enough food to live on.
Mm-hmm.
This essay reflects the situation, and I think we should just take a bit of time to think about the absolute absurdity of the fact that this paper is being given to a symposium on existentialism. There is a symposium happening in France in February 1944. Fondane is completely destitute. Yeah. He's starving, and he's going to talk to some people about something where Camus is talking about, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Maybe if Camus was presenting, I don't know, he wouldn't have did the, and then he drafted the Revolt Symposium would have made it more fitting, but Can you imagine the Can you imagine the absolute? Like, I can imagine how Fonda must have felt in hearing about. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. I was like, fuck
Right.
you. I
Yeah.
imagine
No, and
Sisyphus happy. Because that's you're just trying to keep yourself self-help for the struggle. Like it's 1944 for God's sake. He is about to be like arrested by the Gestapo and sent off to die in one of the most horrible places in human history. It's like it feels like the very existence of the symposium is something that he's calling into question because it's so incredibly comfortable.
of course.
That's a
Like,
good
you
point.
have to imagine the sort of what it presupposes. I mean, obviously, this is probably given Camus, it's probably maybe it's a slight sort of resistance thing to it, but it's 1944. I mean, I guess you've got a few months till Operation Overlord, but there's like, oh my god, how are you having symposiums at a time like this or symposia?
Yeah, and I think too that in a certain sense, this is where I think sometimes you could sort of start to understand, although I don't sympathize with the critique entirely, that Sartre deals with in Existentialism as a Humanism, where the Marxists basically say, actually, like, existentialism is primarily a cultural project and it's relatively bourgeois because it attempts to then like I'm not saying I agree with it, but it attempts to sort of abandon um conditions of the individual. It attempts to sort of provide them with a radical freedom, even though they are in like the most dire of situations. And while like Sartre's progression as an intellectual shows that maybe that's not true, right? He does sort of take issue with this assertion that existentialism is bourgeois because he does attest both in Being a Nothingness and in the CDR that man person is a collection of limitations. Of they are this their field is circumscribed by the impossibilities of particular things. But it's there that I think it's absolutely right. And what's funny is this sort of brutality of the life of the intellectual is one that doesn't go away, right? In the midst of coronavirus, we're still seeing independent intellectuals, professors and stuff, lose homes, lose jobs. And oftentimes it's completely understandable. And this is the most, egregious example, right? This man is about to be killed in the most vicious, mechanized, industrial slaughter that continent had seen. So to a certain extent, yeah, I totally understand that frustration, and I think that's why it's important. In the same way that it's important to understand why Keats was writing the way that he did upon his death, right? It's important to understand where the philosopher was when she was in a position in sort of a historical moment. So yeah, I think that's a good point. I understand the critique of the conference, but I think you're right to say that it is a little bit of blood in the eye of Camus, who's always judged for maybe being a little too edgy.
On the other hand, we could see the conducting of symposia at this time as an affirmation in the face of the atrocity.
Yeah, an act of resistance.
Right. So there is that. I really like the way that you articulated all of what you just said, Will, and I kind of want to focus on the death of Fondane. It makes me wonder in the final moment when the hussars come with their sabers and there is no defense against them. What is our reaction as thinkers, as philosophers, as human beings? I mean, there's a moment at which, we are completely impotent in terms of fighting back against our enemies. But the one thing that we can do is embrace the moment of death as our own, right? And not have them take that from us.
Right.
We must imagine Sisyphus happy. What does it mean in the final moment, devoid of material power in the sense of being able to physically fight back against your enemies? Is there some affirmation left for us, staring in the face of one of the most perhaps tragic possible deaths, one that seems completely absurd, one that belies the idea of rationality, where we are executed for who we are, for what we believe in, our refusal to accept the system that's being imposed upon us. And then we die how? Do we die with the affirmation that, the same kind of affirmation with which we would embrace the most joyful, overtly joyful aspects of life?
But like, what's fascinating here, and maybe this is just like my student brain, and I'm going to do that thing that students do when we talk about 20th century philosophy, is that it's remarkable to me that the way I've been programmed as a student of philosophy is to think like, oh, in death, in death, in death. Who do I think about in death? Oh, Heidegger, right? But in a certain sense, the real historical materiality of the death of the philosopher has always been closer to the situation of Fondane, right? It's never it's rarely at the age of 85. The individuals who present these sorts of, and this is not to create sort of a heroism out of the intellectual or so on, but it's Socrates with the hemlock. It's Fondane dying for no reason other than who he is. It's not this sort of, so maybe what it is, and I've talked about this with Taylor, and Taylor can extend a little bit, and of course we're going to do this because it's Acid Horizon. Maybe that the answer is something closer to Deleuze's interpretation of fate and of being worthy of your fate. Because if there ever was sort of a kind of individual who is sort of worthy of this glorification, it's individuals like Fondane, right? There's a heroism there, a true, actual, unmitigatable martyrdom, and I just think that it's interesting to me that the first place that my mind goes is Heidegger when addressing sort of the most evil of European empires.
Yeah, I mean, the notion of being worthy of what happens to us, I think it's both a way. It's difficult to reconcile maybe directly that Stoic conception of the event with Fondane's notion of this kind of Abrahamic or the God of Job and Abraham and Kierkegaard, right? That the God of the possible that would, unlike Hegelian history, be able to show that that which happened could have happened otherwise, right? So this reconciliation of contingency and necessity, I do think that it would be interesting to kind of turn to logic of sense and to suss some of the implications out and maybe compare with what Fondane is pointing to. But yeah, I mean, if you look at the biographical note that the translator provides, and just like the letters that he writes to his wife Genevieve, and the kind of, I don't want to call it stoic, but the kind of the strength he tries to leave her with, and the reality that even facing what he most surely realizes will be his death, he has a kind of strength, but also a kind of serenity, right? It's both at the same time, and there is that kind of interesting. It has shades of a kind of stoicism to it, but also a kind of courage, and a courage, if not for himself, at least for her, to not to let the inevitable devastate her. And so I find that there's something tender about that excerpt we got to see from his last letters to his wife, and there's something there's some real strength in that exhibition of love for his wife.
I think the comparison between someone like Socrates with Fondane, I think it brings up a very paradoxical question of martyrdom, because Martin usually thinks of dying for a cause or for a reason, but if anything, even it may be, if we say that Fondane's cause was unreason, unknowledge, yes, in that sense he was a martyr, because that there wasn't. I think maybe to contempt the radical negativity of something like Auschwitz-Birkenau and the Holocaust, it's Fontaine. Fontaine died for no reason whatsoever.
But that's the very point.
Yeah, I think
right?
So. In that sense, he's a paradoxical martyr, because he's a martyr for dying for sort of unknowledge, because he died for no reason whatsoever. In that sense,
exactly. But in that sense, it's fundamentally different, right, from Socrates, because it's stripped of those liberalist notions of sort of choosing to right, because if you look at Crito, right, Socrates essentially is saying, I perpetually consent to this government, and therefore I must perpetually consent to its ruling, and therefore I drink the hemlock. But that's not the situation of the existential man, right? The existential man must always be sort of in a situation of a very particular kind of rejection. And that's sort of where I am. It's a very particular kind of death philosophically. But I just don't think it's worth skipping over that detail of Fondane's life, because I do think that unlike the example in Camus about the man who writes the story and then kills himself, I think that's an absurd reasoning. This death is very different, but it does contextualize the importance of the very thing at hand in Fondane, the very crisis that was in Existential Monday. So I just don't think it's worth ignoring that, particularly given the way in which existentialism operates surrounding the Second World War. That intellectual movement does not have the legs that it does in Europe without that campaign of destruction. It just simply doesn't. There would not have been an appetite for Camus and Sartre and Beauvoir like that without World War II. And I'm willing to die on that hill over and over and over again.
No, I think you're right. I mean,
well, let's wrap it up. Final thoughts on the text. Maybe we'll start with Taylor, and then we'll go Adam, Will, and then I'll finish it up.
Final thoughts. Yes. Well, my final thought is it's I like coming back to this because after because my first introduction, like so many people, is through the existentialists, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and these others. Whether you would consider them existentialists proper or not is up to dispute, and we could take Fondane's ways of classifying it as he tries to wrap up his essay, or you can take the more generic distinctions of the history of philosophy. But I do think that in that sense, it's nice to be able to come back to this at this point in my philosophical trajectory, and not to have started with this, because if this were to be something that one reads before being exposed to, whether it be Kierkegaard or Hegel or Nietzsche or Camus, then I feel like it might not have the kind of impact. And I just want to read that Kafka line, and I'll let you guys speak. But I really do love this, which we see at the end and at the beginning of the essay, that you are destined for a great Monday, well spoken, but Sunday will never end. I really think that's especially with what we just discussed in terms of what eventually happened to Fondane, that gives it a kind of extra weight and even almost makes it a little sinister. But I do think that that line, or those two sentences, the little quote from Kafka, both kind of sums up the that sort of irrational absurdist aspect, but it also is kind of a rallying cry, right, in the face of what is proclaimed to be inevitable.
Okay, Adam. Yeah, what do you got?
Well, yeah, I definitely want to agree with Taylor. Yeah, because the essay is called Existential Monday and the Sunday of History, because sort of the completion of speculative philosophy, the end of philosophy, is sort of the Sunday of is meant to be projected as the Sunday of knowledge and the Sunday of life, the completion of knowledge, the limitation of what is imminently possible to be known and for knowledge to ever know. And also the other figure of the Sunday is the establishment of the law, of the Sabbath. And sort of as the law, Sunday sort of hovers over every other day of the week. Sunday will never end. But the Monday part, Existential Monday, is the beginning at the opening up a site of resistance to knowledge, a site of unknowledge within this very sense itself. It's a new space of struggle, and I think this is an incredibly underrated essay and very promising essay. I think opening up spaces of unknowledge in a way that interacts with, I guess, a much wider array of thinkers than, say, someone like maybe Bataille was working with, because he was primarily thinking about Hegel. I think this is probably going to be quite a useful essay for anyone trying to think of a non-philosophy or a post-philosophy. It's the ability to start taking not even knowledge seriously before the radical negativity of the hussars, but to even take the flight from knowledge seriously. And I think that expands the capacity of thought to engage with life as a space of equally knowledge and unknowledge.
Will, what do you got?
Oh, you can't make me top that. Damn it. But yeah, I'll close with something simple. I think it's remarkable that there are voices like this throughout the history of philosophy that are just completely just brushed over. There's a philosophical density to this that you don't get in other existential works, but particularly that of Camus, and in a lot of ways of Simone de Beauvoir. And in a certain sense, I can't help but think it was because of the terrible fate that this philosopher author faced. So in a certain sense, like, I think this is a remarkable essay, but what's so remarkable about it is just the amount of prerequisites that are required in order to actually pin this thing down. I mean, basically opening with an obscure Hegelian text and ending with the monadology. So what I'll say is I think it, what I like about Acid Horizon, and what I think this discussion proves, and we should try to prove over and over again, is that finding these minor voices with major contributions is so fundamentally important to the process of retrospective analyses of thought. And of course, I just agree with everything Adam said and can't top it. So that's what I'll provide.
Can't top it, my ass. That was great.
Well, what I've done is I actually, starting from page 28, where he talks about the difference between existential and non-existential philosophy, in my notes, I constructed what I call the 10 theses of existential philosophy by Benjamin Fondane, and I just kind of recast and interpolated some of what he said there. And I'm probably going to post that online because I thought the work that I did there was kind of fun and interesting. And so I'm opening a Substack. It's happening, fellas. So I will put that on there. Whoa. But that said, I think my biggest takeaway from this is there's a way in which Fondane's existentialism, as we pointed out, really flies in the face of or challenges folks like Camus and Sartre in positing existentialism as a kind of refusal, that we said, the refusal of the enclosure of one's own immanence and the immanence of the system, false exits, false transcendences, like he says. And I think at the very least, one of the lessons of this essay is we should be suspicious of the imposition of moral calm of any sort of idea, whether it be a philosophy or just kind of conventional wisdom or advice, especially of the Jordan Peterson variety, right? There is a virtue in existing at the edge of the torture, existing with the spur in our back. And
Right.
And I think the ethos of Fondane's philosophy is just buttressed by the fact that this was his last writing. So he had both the literal and figurative bayonet at his back while writing this. And it makes me think, like, okay, wow, this is the existential philosophy that we've been waiting for.
But it's almost existential philosophy as the limit experience, too. So in a certain sense, it's special for that
Precisely,
purpose.
yeah, because this philosophy actualizes itself. And thank you for listening to our episode on Benjamin Fondane. If you love what we are doing here at Acid Horizon, why not support us in some way or another? That could be as simple as hopping on our Twitter, retweeting some of our episodes, and so on, or it could mean becoming a patron for as little as $1, whereupon you can access some Patreon exclusive content. Also, we have a merch store, critdrip.com, that's crit-drip.com, where you can pick up a philosophy t-shirt or hoodie. Also, I have written a short reflection piece on this Fondane essays that I call the Theses of Fondanean Existential Philosophy. And it's somewhat of a summation of what we find in the essay, but I put a finer point on some of the ideas that he mentions in regard to what distinguishes an existential philosophy. Go ahead and find that Substack post somewhere on our Twitter page. And if you can't find it, just email me or at me on Twitter, and we will get that out to you. Once again, thank you for listening, and stay safe for now. We will see you next time.